So hi, so we're very honored today to have a panel of experts with a very varied background. We have professors, innovators, Dean, Damien, also a drug development guru, to innovator entrepreneurs, Yupti, Amrish, and Gurpreet, to be with us today on this panel discussion. It is very gratifying to know that although we are from different background at different spectrum of this whole research, technology, innovation space, we really all share the same objectives in this discussion. Objectives of number one, delivering better care that is patient-centric, people-centric, and number two, providing tools that will shift the paradigm from care to health. Really, we're looking at healthcare being a continuum that will relate to giving people better quality of lives. So the panel today is going to take us through the whole research and technology development journey of Singapore, mostly founded during peacetime, and how that foundation has enabled us to customize a battle plan to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, also more importantly, to also talk about this, or rather analyze the question of the fact that we know that this is not going to be the last pandemic that the world is ever going to see. Then how are we going to future-proof ourselves for a future pandemic? So coming back to the innovations and tools and solutions that we need for this COVID-19 pandemic. So before we start the discussion, I will just quickly, briefly go through a couple issues that we talk about when we talk about solutions. So in the context of this COVID-19, we're really looking at a whole spectrum of solutions, not just therapeutics, vaccine, or diagnostics. It's really the whole spectrum from population management, early detection, diagnosis, isolation, the care, the post-care management. So if we just talk about population management, for example, it's almost more about the discipline, the social science, less about the technology. We all know about the science, for example, how the virus transmits, how we need safe management measures like mask, hygiene, safe distancing, self-awareness, the whole discipline that we all need in order to enforce and manage. Is really up to the individuals, but we know that not everybody does it. So there's really a lot more to do with the social science, not all to do with technology. So when we talk about managing a situation like this pandemic, we're really looking at how do we address this from various different aspects. Of course, very quickly, when we talk about early detection and diagnosis, again, we are referring to the whole process of managing the workflow. It's not about the technology, it's not about the assay, it's about how people get swabbed, the logistics, what specimens we use, how do we test them, is it point of care, is it lab test, do we pool the testing, and so on. I would leave the rest of the discussions to the panel to take us through this how do we address the research and technology development with respect to looking for tools and solutions to better prepare ourselves for pandemic, the current one as well as any future one. And I will like to end this introduction by quoting something that was written in a recent article in the Straits Times by Professor Damien here and our colleague David Lai of NCID, that with each battle, we learn and adapt and develop new tools and technologies. As the world tries to overcome the COVID-19 pandemic, we can draw hope from the scale of cooperation witnessed in Singapore and around the world. So this is really what we hope to do. I would like to start the discussion by inviting maybe every one of our panelists here today to first introduce themselves, talk about what their entity is doing, introduce what they do during peacetime, and how they have been mobilized in this pandemic to help us in Singapore and the rest of the world in this battle in this COVID-19 pandemic. And we would like to start with maybe Damien. Damien?
Yes, good afternoon, Sydney, and good afternoon, fellow panelists. It's an absolute privilege to be here and to have this discussion today. By way of background, I'm a physician by training, originally from Ireland, who has worked in the drug discovery and development industry in mainstream manufacturing, development, and so forth for over 20 years. And I had the privilege to come here 2 years ago to Singapore to create what's called the Experimental Drug Development Center. That center is essentially a translational hub, so to speak, that works with investigators across public as well as biotech industries here in Singapore to try and work with them to translate their great science into potentially great medicines. And we've been integrating legacy units of the Experimental Therapeutic Center, the D3 Translational Group, as well as more recently the Experimental Biologics Center. So it's in that context that we are here as a national entity in Singapore to assist in that domain. And I guess it's then pertinent to today's discussion that the mobilization of this unit in the context of this COVID pandemic. I mean, the reality is that we've had and been building the expertise in both basic, translational, and drug discovery sciences for the last decade and more. And indeed, where we're currently situated at Chromos Building in Biopolis, it was actually the previous place where Novartis Institute of Tropical Diseases labs were. And indeed, we have some of those folks actually now in EDDC. So in a way, sort of infectious diseases and experience and understanding of that has been here for quite a while. Furthermore, actually, the legacy units of ETC and D3 have developed a number of vaccines and therapeutics against infectious diseases over a number of years. For example, we were involved in the testing of the VLP vaccine for H1N1 influenza a number of years ago. But beyond the therapeutics, I think probably, as a lot of people may be aware, and Sydney is certainly aware, we've been involved in the development of diagnostic assays, collaborated with BTI, BII, TTSH, and others to develop diagnostics for SARS, avian flu, H5N1, MERS, Zika virus, and more recently, as I think has become pretty famous here in Singapore, the Fortitude kit, or the kit that was developed for SARS-CoV. And it is, in fact, frankly, the reality that had we not had that experience, the rapid ability to bring this test to sort of to the front line would not have been possible. And I think we did that in a matter of, frankly, weeks to get it to a point where it was actually being deployed at the front line. And beyond that now, working with DXD Hub and Mirexis, we know that this kit has evolved further and is deployed in a multinational way. Of course, in that context, we're not just working with the diagnostic kit, we're also supporting several local programs to address the immediate situation at hand with both short, mid, and long-term views in the context of therapeutics. Let me just say that, you know, the reality is we're working with a number of other companies and supporting their efforts, such as ASLAM, OM Biosciences, Rea Pharmaceutical, as just some, where they've come up with possibilities of repurposing or indeed exploring potentially COVID-related activity. And we've been supporting them to that end. More recently, we've been very actively working with the DSO and with Hummingbird in deploying a monoclonal antibody as a future therapeutic in this COVID space. And indeed, we have entered clinical trials. And again, just an example of how quickly we've been able to move. You know, colleagues in the DSO first identified this antibody in recovering patient, and we've now moved to go from that, which was essentially in March, to already being in the clinic at the end of October. And we could only do so on the basis of really, frankly, a team effort not just in the context of what we were doing in EDDC, with DSO, but also in the context of Hummingbird, and importantly and very critically, when we are in such a war, as Sydney pointed out, we need the support of regulators who understand the criticality of moving some of these potential therapeutics into the clinic fast. It's not like peacetime, and of course we never bypass the safety reality of testing these therapeutics, but in a situation where patients are dying, and the reality is they are. And as you've seen, even this week, we have reached record numbers of deaths in the UK, in France, and the US. It's very important we get to test potential therapeutics fast. And I think one of the things we've seen in Singapore is we've had that spirit, we've had that ability to move things very quickly from idea, from concept to reality, to be able to test it. So I think in that sense, you know, it is very, today's theme is about how you can go from peacetime to wartime, how you can deploy, redeploy your expertise and bring to bear what's critical. I guess if I can finish, Sydney pointed out earlier, the patients are waiting. And if we don't do something, the patients may die.
Thank you, Damien. Well, indeed, the key element in terms of speed when it comes to crisis time like this is something that keeps occurring when we are looking at taking output of R&D into the market. And we will see that appearing over and over again as we go through each and every one of our panelists here. And that speed, it's something that, you know, would not be dependent on any one particular element or aspect or individual or entity to do. It is actually a collaboration of the regulatory authorities and the different teams and different countries together. And I'd like to take the opportunity to invite also Dean to introduce yourself and what you do in your institute, a very exciting one, talking about a lot of innovations that have been featured by National Geographic, you know, CNN. Would love to hear more about that, and you know, some of the innovations that we are looking at, how it could address, you know, not just this pandemic, but, you know, anything that we see that will be coming our way in the future. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Sydney. Hello, everybody. I'm Dean Ho. I am the director of the N1 Institute for Health, as well as the Institute for Digital Medicine, also known as Wisdom, at the National University of Singapore. And these institutes are clinical stage. So we run a number of interventional clinical trials, from everything from personalizing cancer care to digital therapeutics to address cognitive decline, and more recently deploying a platform known as Identify to rapidly pinpoint optimal drug combinations against the coronavirus. Something interesting about these institutes, which alludes to some of the early introduction, is that our core ethos is that technology alone cannot transform healthcare. And it really takes a true interface between technology development, healthcare economics, behavioral sciences, regulatory expertise, and beyond to ensure that these technologies are used, they are actually deployable and integratable into healthcare workflows, and that their use is sustained and economically makes sense. And so to that end, many months ago, probably around January, we convened a team of global health security and surveillance experts, healthcare economists, et cetera, because at the time, much of our work was in oncology. And we knew that we had a platform that would be able to very rapidly pinpoint optimal drug combinations, specifically relevant for potential outbreaks / pandemics. And I think it became very apparent from our work together that we needed something quick, we needed something that was economical to use, and we needed something that was a departure from traditional AI. And what I mean by that is Identify does not use pre-existing data to make predictions about how drugs interact and how different combinations may be useful. In fact, we don't do any in silico work at all. What Identify does is we run strategically designed prospective experiments on actual samples, be it a biopsy for cancer or the live virus, to interrogate huge parameter spaces, right? If you take 12 candidate drugs, which we did at the time, right? This is around April. These are drugs that were in clinical trials around that time frame. 12 is not a big number, but if you interrogate each drug at 10 different doses, that's 1 trillion possible combinations, right? And so what we do is we don't need that many. We need a couple hundred experiments, and we interrogate this entire parameter space. And within 2 weeks, we have a ranked list of experimentally backed combinations from best all the way to worst. So this gives clinicians options not only regarding which combinations may be useful against the coronavirus, but it also gives options of which combinations probably should not receive that much attention. A couple things I'll summarize. We found a lot of combinations that were shown to be relatively ineffective that were in clinical trials at the time. And ultimately, our results aligned with all of the clinical readouts without needing any data from those clinical trials. And at the same time, we were able to show that certain drugs that really don't work that well on their own, when placed together at proper doses, which by the way, are all clinically relevant, remarkable improvements in efficacy were realized, right? And so what we tell people often is that, clinical trials certainly can fail, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, but a lot of times that failure occurs when the combinations are first being developed. Right, and so the ultimate value of Identify here, what we're further exploring it for, is as a first line of defense for future outbreaks, where once live viruses are isolated, give us about 2 weeks, give us a pool of actionable therapeutics that are locally available, for example, and we can come up with experimentally derived and optimized drug combinations, again, for potential clinical validation or potential combinations to avoid, in fact. To conclude, a number of international collaborators approached us for the data that we had from our studies, and we've had multiple approved clinical protocols, both to use Identify as a first line of defense clinical decision support tool, as well as specific regimens being trialed as well. We developed this as a public benefit platform. So we continue to run assays of different strains of coronavirus that emerge, to look at the evolution of how these ranked combinations will change over time, so that we'll always be ready. I'll finalize by saying that this is all possible by being part of an amazing ecosystem in Singapore. As Damien mentioned, an amazing regulatory system, an amazing collaborative environment. We're privileged to be here, and we look forward to continued work with everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean. So again, this is, speed, again, is really the theme in terms of how the platform, is able to very quickly, we're talking about doing drug discovery in terms of weeks. Damien earlier talked about taking R&D output to diagnostics product approval in terms of weeks, in terms of we're talking about in terms of 3 weeks. So, we're seeing many different countries and different entities trying to deal with this crisis by collaborating with different entities in order to deal with how to accelerate something to the market. We are also seeing from the company's perspectives a different way of addressing this crisis by repurposing, diversification, and redeployment of different resources to deal with that. And so I would like to then take that theme to introduce our next 3 panelists who are really entrepreneur innovators in the startup, in the company, in the different companies that have had to do a number of these variations to accelerate the innovations to deal with the crisis. And maybe we would start with Yukti to introduce Lucence and what Lucence is as a company and how Lucens has been very successful in diversifying and taking us to different solutions for this pandemic. Yukti?
Thank you, Sydney, and it's my privilege here to be at this panel discussion. So I'm Yukti, co-founder and CTO at Lucens, and we're a relatively young company. We started in 2017, and we're talking about what we do in peacetime. And what we do in peacetime is really to focus on improving the clinical management of cancer patients, essentially. And we have several molecular diagnostic assays that we have developed out of Lucens, some of which are in clinical practice today, which help in ultra-sensitive and non-invasive testing for cancer patients. So, for example, our flagship product, which is Liquid Hallmark, is a liquid biopsy-based test that enables the molecular profiling of a large number of genes, which are cancer genes, which are relevant to multiple cancer types, up to 15 cancer types, and we can, using our technology and our expertise in molecular biology, we're able to call mutations and variants down to 0.1% variant allele frequency, or even lesser confidently. So our vision has always been to make testing for cancer patients for their treatment faster, more affordable, more accurate, and less invasive, for physicians to be able to make decisions faster. So having said that, we are a cancer diagnostics company, but in so the so-called wartime, what we have been able to do in the COVID-19 pandemic is we've considered and then committed our technological expertise in developing diagnostic assays for testing in SARS-CoV-2. So not only the testing, but this, our commitment encompassed the entire life cycle of handling a SARS-CoV-2 related sample. That is from collection to accurate testing, and even the scope for massive scaling for testing. And I'm very happy to share the more during specifics of the technological diversification or pivoting that we had to do during this, through the course of this panel discussion. And what I would say, yes, speed was key in providing a quick response to this situation, but the biggest challenge was not forgetting what our focus was and our commitment to cancer diagnostics, while also being able to bring to the forefront our experience and expertise in being able to design tests which would meaningfully impact the situation. Yeah, so that's how we have turned around in a short time from being a pure cancer diagnostics company to someone who can deal with a completely different entity, and that's the introduction, and be happy to go more into details of what Lucens exactly is doing during the panel discussion. Thanks, Sydney.
Thank you, Yukti. We'll be very excited to hear you talk more about some of the innovations, like, for example, SAFER. You know, as we talked about earlier, when we refer to diagnostics, I like to always tell people that when we talk about diagnostics, it's not really about the assay, it's really about, I use the word anatomy of a diagnostics, because we're really talking about a whole system. So obviously something, an innovation like SAFER would be something that we would, you know, like to hear more about, you know, maybe later. I think we would like to take the now hear from a couple more data analytics and digital health companies. Raspberry from Guprit. Maybe at this point I would also want to draw on this word crisis in in Chinese, language is really written as a combination of risk and opportunity. I like to draw on that word in Chinese because what it shows is normally in times of crisis, it allows us to leverage that. However unfortunate it is, it does allow us to leverage crisis as an opportunity for growth in many areas. And I'd like to think that opportunity for Singapore to look at some of the things that we can do better and how can we help ourselves grow in some areas better moving forward from the perspective of companies. Leverage that as an opportunity to help the companies grow in different areas. And again, we come back to, is it in diversification? Is it in deployment, redeployment, as Damien mentioned? Is it in repurposing? And I mentioned that in the context of, of course, data analytics and digital health being, perhaps in the COVID-19 pandemic has become more prevalent and maybe more relevant, perhaps not prevalent, but more relevant, just because we have had to leverage a lot of that for many aspects like telemedicine, just because of all the safe distancing management measures that we have had to put in. And certainly in the space of digital health and data analytics, it also had help with the monitoring and management of a lot of these cases. And I'd like to maybe invite Gurpreet to introduce the company. Of course, introduce yourself and the company and what the company does. The same theme again, what we do during peacetime and what is the impact to us in crisis, and of course, how do we leverage that crisis as an opportunity to grow for now and in the future? Thank you, Gurpreet.
Yep. So thanks very much, Sydney, for that kind introduction. So my name is Gurpreet. I'm the founder for Raspberry. Essentially, we are a medical device spin-off company from the Agency for Science, Technology and Research. Our core focus is on helping providers and patients streamline chronic care management using artificial intelligence processes, behavioral sciences, and systems. This can include processing, sieving of medical and behavioral data, and essentially streamlining them into very simple automated reports and systems. We fundamentally focus on core chronic diseases that include COPD, heart failure, and mental health. So some of our analytics and platforms are actually associated with those diseases. COVID-19 was very interesting actually for us because it was one of the very newer use cases in which we actually were not really built for, but because of the need of such platforms and technology, we had to kind of switch gear and rapidly deploy it to assist the healthcare professionals in the local ecosystem and even in the broader ecosystem as well. Interestingly, the platform is highly relevant because what it uses is novel respiratory biomarkers of physiology from which you can actually use and extract features to predict clinical deterioration in COVID-19 patients. As you know that some of the signs and symptoms include shortness of breath, for example. So very simple physiology data that we kind of extract and we build certain predictive AI on it. So the way we worked on it is we work with providers to deploy Raspberry in QuickTime. This actually was used to assist in digital patient monitoring and predictive AI on COVID-19. We use Raspberry to monitor respiratory and hemodynamic variability, and then we use it to basically alert on impending clinical deteriorations. I'm humbled to share that in fact Raspberry was able to save lives in hospitals, and we were in fact able to predict clinical deterioration. Some of the interesting features and combinations that we use to predict clinical deterioration and save lives were in fact respiratory centric compared to conventionally understood hemodynamics like oxygen saturation and heart rate or heart rate variability. And these were actually very gratifying for Raspberry indeed. What we do look forward to is moving ahead to further enhance and use COVID-19 as a platform to further accelerate our partnerships with the broader ecosystem, and that includes both the hospitals, the pharmaceutical companies, as well as the providers, so that we can provide better care and in fact use better use of some of the platforms and technologies for the broader ecosystem at large. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Gurpreet. Thank you for sharing the exciting update of how Raspberry has really made an impact, direct impact to patients. Last but not least, biorhythm. Amrish, would love to hear how biorhythm is involved in this, as a digital health company that is really in women's health space, and would just be really exciting to hear, how what we are also using what we know, as in peacetime to deal with this the situation.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm, like you mentioned, I'm the co-founder of Biorhythm, and we're a company developing a pregnancy monitoring platform for remote monitoring purposes. And this is with the intention of improving both the patient and the clinician journey, management of costs, and also improving clinical outcomes, three of which are essential during a period like COVID. And the platform really consists of a few different components, including monitors, which we have designed and developed to be able to use by mothers themselves. Very critical aspect of distributing healthcare and sort of democratizing pregnancy healthcare into the hands of the mothers. Mobile applications which serves as centers of education, device management, as well as communication with the clinicians. All three aspects very key during a phase where health is no longer within the confines of the four walls of a hospital, but rather in the community and where women are agents of their own healthcare. And finally is the Clinician Platform, where we really use analytics and data to objectively determine maternal and fetal health, that can give clinicians good idea on decompensation of babies or mothers, and or how they're doing, both with regards to adjacent areas like mental health, like their psychological health, as well as physical health. So, I mean, during peacetime, I'm generally the guy who makes the coffee in the office, but I mean, during wartime, it's entirely different during a pandemic, and it's about how do we position the company so that, we're prepared for the future, and we're really in that shape to be able to leverage future needs. And I think it was really a doubling down on the vision of providing accessibility to healthcare, and how do we make every individual an agent of their own healthcare and responsible for their own healthcare, not looking at hospitals purely for care, but how do we enable data to move between walls and between different stakeholders. So COVID for us really did one thing, and that was the behavioral change in care. And it got people really thinking about, what fundamentally do we need in care? Do we really need pregnant patients to go into hospital for every single appointment and risk nosocomial infections, where it could lead to preterm effects, it could lead to other effects on the pregnancy? Or do we enable women to be able to handle some parts of their care? And how do we make this, how do we do this on a population level? So COVID really accelerated the mindset, clinicians, patients, and all the other stakeholders on a rethink in healthcare and how remote health data can actually improve healthcare beyond the traditional sense, beyond the traditional means of health. So yeah, I mean, to keep it short, it's been a very humbling experience being able to, serve our customers in UK, Australia, Singapore, where, the universities have really come to us and said, these are, our needs, they've not changed, but now they've just accelerated. And so, yeah, I mean, it's been very humbling to know that we can play our part in helping women during their pregnancy journeys, and also to make pregnancy care better. Thanks.
Thank you, Amrish. So actually, one of the reasons why I decided to organize the panel discussion this way, by actually really inviting each of the panelists to take really enough time to talk about themselves and to talk about what they do, what the entity does, it's really just a highlight. It's really a way to highlight the investments of Singapore, how Singapore has invested over the last few decades in building the foundation of research and development, technology development, talent development. You know, we see our entrepreneurs spinning out companies, and we see our professors being very, very innovative, and also participating a lot in development of solutions. This is really, you know, one of the example to show how the investments in R&D, sometimes at the point that it happens, that's the whole point about R&D is it does take time, as in it's not something that is going to, you know, what you do today, you're going to see the impact tomorrow or the next year. But I think this is one reflection of the impact of what we have done over the past few decades that is able to enable us to very quickly deal with a situation like this. But it also highlighted, I would say, a rather maybe peculiar phenomenon that, you know, as I said earlier on, that the other topic that we really would like the panelists to discuss is it's not the first pandemic that we have. Well, it's the first global one in a while, but certainly we've gone through many outbreaks and many epidemics, and it feels like we, you know, in Singapore, maybe we've done relatively well. It's of course not just a matter of research and technology; it's also mindset. But it just doesn't seem like the world is still quite prepared for this. So we have had some discussion. I've had some discussion with Damien earlier about this topic about, you know, why is it that, you know, that the world thinks that we're not going to have another one. So, well, actually, I shouldn't say that. I meant to say that why is it that since SARS that, you know, the world was not more ready to deal with this, even though it has taken 17 years since then. So, you know, maybe I'd like to invite Damien to start this round of discussion and invite the rest of the panelists to join in and maybe give some opinion of, you know, how we see ourselves moving forward. You know, really maybe more to do with changing of the mindset in order to make everything else work. Damien?
Thanks, Sydney. I guess even since we discussed earlier, I've been reflecting myself, why is it that in a way we haven't learned from previous outbreaks? And actually, I think it boils down probably to the context of societal impact. If you think about where we are now, I think the societal impact of this current pandemic is global. It's global in the context of both the illness, but it's global in the context of economic, in terms of psychological, in terms of the context of even a current generation of teenagers who have had to adapt to a very different lifestyle. Something completely that the rest of us who luckily have got through our teens, you know, remember that we managed to have fun in our lives. There's no fun at the moment. If you look at the elderly population, you know, essentially locked down. And so I think, reflecting on it, I think the reality is we're in a pandemic where the totality of the impact is at a scale above and beyond what's gone before. And I think it's in that context that I think has mobilized our thinking. And today has been an excellent example of, across a whole diversity of skill sets, backgrounds, what we do, where that mobilization has become critical. So I think, you know, we have to think about it as well. How do we prepare for this in future? Because we have all been in a reactive mode. We've been reacting to the situation as it's evolved. The reactions, simply put, I mean, I can tell you personally, I thought at the start of the year, I might be able to travel in the middle of the year. By the middle of the year, I thought the end of the year. The way it's going, it might be the end of next year. You know, that's the reality. We're all actually learning here, learning for the first time in the context of a true global pandemic. Probably people say that the last of this scale was the Spanish flu. And unfortunately, none of us are old. Maybe I'm close to it to remember that reality of the Spanish flu and what actually happened. And for those who know their history, it took 3 years for that to basically blow out. In my current lifetime, I think the only thing that's probably been close to this, when I was a medical student, we started to hear about what was called slim disease emanating out of Africa. And then we realized and understood that it was HIV, acquired immune deficiency syndrome. And we understood over time the impact that that had. So I think we need to recognize that these will recur. But how can we learn in time and peacetime? We're in wartime now, but how can we be prepared in peacetime? We don't let this societal impact of the scale happen again. We must learn, and I think it's about how can we incentivize, how can we allow, because you talked about commercialization. There's very little incentivization to commercialize for a preventative if it's not being used. Let's just use the example of a therapeutic. How can you incentivize somebody who develops a therapeutic and you tell them you're going to put it on the shelf? You're not actually going to sell any of it, but it's there just in case. So, you know, that's a challenging model. Let me use the example of maybe antimicrobial resistance, where people are starting to think about vouchers. How can you incentivize? And I think across the globe, we need to think about how can we incentivize that we have things ready for wartime, even though we're in peacetime, that we have things ready to deploy rather than essentially thinking, how will we deploy? And may I finally, if you allow me, just summarize. Today is a perfect example that you have to combine all of these things together to really sort of maximize the impact from the societal perspective. It's not one, it's not therapeutics, it's not diagnostics. It's all of the other aspects. It's data. It's about deploying physiological measurements. It's about managing the population, as Amrish said. How do you keep pregnant patients out of hospital when the hospitals are essentially become war zones, but people are still pregnant and you want to look after them? You know, I mean, there's a big issue in Europe at this time, and then maybe it's coming to Yukti as well. There's a real worry that effectively cancer screening and treatments have essentially been stopped. And frankly, you can take that to other diseases, cardiovascular, but in the current wartime, people have stopped getting their regular screening. We're going to be faced with, I think, a huge wave of patients who will develop cancer who unfortunately would not have had their screening ongoing. How do we allow for regular screening of such patients in the context when your hospitals are essentially filled with patients as we are now? Again, something I think Amrish is a nice indicator where you can take some of that back to the patient. But I think we need to think about this in the future. I think this is really a moment in history where we really need to learn and not repeat history in the future.
Thank you, Damien. I was actually hoping for you to be answering some of those questions, but you ended up asking more questions. So I actually need the other panelists to then address some of the questions that Damien asked. Very interestingly, you know, of course, it is this thing about commercial incentives is, you know, of course, maybe at the end of the day is the fact that, you know, where is that commercial incentive for a lot of these big companies to want to invest in something like this. And of course, this global pandemic has shown that it has a direct economic impact, and therefore it has become an incentive in itself for a lot of this to happen. You know, but moving forward, you know, who takes the responsibility, and how do we you know, better prepare for that? Is there a hybrid model of a public-private partnership between the government and the private sector, you know, to prepare for that? You know, I like to open the floor to the other panelists to chime in to, you know, maybe provide some, you know, some thoughts, but, you know, could be from some of your experience, you know, in working with the different entities, and how that has allowed some things to happen, you know, quickly, and maybe that is something that we can leverage and build that up into a bigger scale.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in really fast and just talk about, you know, our experience after we started running some of our Identify assays. it took us 2 weeks to finish the assay and to come out with that first ranked list of therapies. But we spent 2 months after that studying supply chain, right? 2 weeks to actually do the science, 2 months to look at a concept that really wasn't on our radar even a few weeks prior, right? We were having discussions with, ex-CDC field epidemiologists to understand, hey, where do you think drug shortages are going to happen and where? Where do you think some of these therapies are going to be available out in Asia, et cetera? I think that when we think about the evolution of healthcare, seamless integration between the healthcare workflows and models that we know or that we knew before and disciplines that we had no idea would be so central to being able to deliver even bare necessities in healthcare, all the way to optimizing healthcare, will become increasingly important. And so very quickly, I think to maintain preparedness, it may be easier, right? We were doing almost all oncology before COVID. It may be easier to say, well, if a vaccine shows up, maybe you will just kind of go back to oncology and deal with optimizing drug combos for infectious diseases later. But I think it's become very clear to us that our very next step is we're actually rerunning Identify in a few weeks with a wonderful collaborator here on a totally different set of therapies, which, by the way, the recommendations of these therapies were from clinicians all over Singapore, from all the different entities, with the criteria that they are widely available, certainly accessible for that reason, and also that these are therapies clinicians actually would deploy if needed, for everything ranging from early infection to later, so that we have evolving answers. As new strains continue to be identified, as new strains evolve from our international partners, we're going to keep running Identify. And it's actually inexpensive to do, right? All we need is a liquid handler, some live virus, and a little bit of time, right? But it's really then now involving a discussion of what therapies should we employ so that we're ready if something else happens. And then finally, this involves a complete relook at repurposing, right? Repurposing involves, hey, there's a drug developed for something else, maybe it'll work for this. Maybe if we combine it with something else, it'll work better. But that process can be quite challenging when the parameter space is really big, right? There are therapies, and we have data on that, real data, right? Actual experimental data. These therapies are no good on their own, but placed with other drugs at the right doses, et cetera, there's a remarkable emergence of unforeseen drug interaction. And you know what? These are things we've already validated in human for oncology. And we've also seen this happen for other infectious diseases as well, right? So this whole process involves a complete rethink, a complete reintegration of different disciplines, different mindsets moving forward. And you know what? If we continue to move forward with these new outlooks, I'd say the future could be very bright for many facets of medicine, but we have to stay the course. I think that's what's critical, right? Yes, a vaccine could be on the way. It's very exciting, but from what we've learned, we've got to stay the course and keep moving forward.
Can I just chip in very quickly to Dean's point? So I think in addition to technology and science being there and doing whatever great job that it's doing, I think more fundamentally, what's really important is to figure out what are the operations and processes that you can tie in from the academic side, even from the research institutes all the way down to the healthcare professionals. Because if there's one thing that we actually learned, at least through Raspberry's journey, was the fact that this public-private partnership is extremely important, especially when you actually have non-peacetime scenarios like what we have seen in COVID-19. And potentially it could also be one of the ways in which we can look at creating new vaccines and new therapeutics, which we don't really know whether it will actually happen or not. But at least the academic side can be prepared, and we need to kind of start to think about what are the processes and operations that we need to create on a higher level, on a much more broader strategic view, in which you can actually take these relevant ideas or knowledge or IPs or licenses that you have in the academic world and in the research institutes and quickly translate it down to actual operations. And we can start thinking about that from a much more broader perspective, creating strategies, creating blueprint models in place now, using COVID-19 as a platform, then I think in the next pandemic, that if it hopefully doesn't come, but if it does come, we probably would be better prepared for that.
Yep. If I could just chime in as well. I mean, Damien brought up a phenomenal point on, we haven't even started the count on the extra effects of the pandemic, right? You know, the heart attack, strokes that we've missed, the early cancer detections that we've missed. And I think the real learning from here is, how do we as a whole, if we have a problem, not exclude everyone else as well, who actually need proper medical care? And, you know, how hospitals should have a physical layer of healthcare, a digital layer of healthcare. How can you move seamlessly between both? It's about building platforms, right? That's exactly what Dean, Gurpreet, and Yukti have done. It's building platforms that can serve a public good when called upon, but also serve multiple other purposes during peacetime. You know, like Damien said, you can't just put something on the counter and just hope it solves something someday, right? But rather build systems, physical and digital, that are flexible enough to really move between conditions, diseases, that are able to generally measure well-being from a clinical perspective down to the individual perspective. So I think one thing, like I said, you know, Singapore's been all about preparedness, right? I think 4 years ago, if you asked anyone in the last 4 years, no one would have heard of NCID or known what it stood for. But the fact is, it was there ready. It served its purpose during peacetime, but now it serves a purpose as well. So having that infrastructure that is just flexible enough was, I would say, a foresight that many other governments didn't have. But we can do one even better from here and look at, you know, how did the rest of the population fare? Besides those who had COVID, and, you know, what was the real effect on there? So I think that's the real improvement that we can see going forward, and how we can improve our response in the future.
So,
do you have anything to add?
yeah, so I would like to just say, from our experience and looking forward in order to prevent the next crisis, I think the main thing should be looking at how we can port the technologies that we have in place already quickly and flexibly to do testing at a scale which in fact perhaps prevents the crisis from blowing over. And what if it never came to this stage where we had to deal with having to test the whole population because it has gotten out of hand? So what if we employed high throughput methods which are in place already, such as next generation sequencing for sequencing the whole human genome, but instead put that in place for testing at an early stage before the infections have spread beyond control, to test the as many people as is necessary to curb the pandemic if it should so happen again, to curb this pandemic before it gets out of hand. So I really think that's something we have seen being put in practice even at Lucens, where we have seen the potential for things that we had thought about perhaps 3-4 years ago, but never came to pass because there was no such crisis, such as the use of a better sample collection system, which makes it easier, safer for healthcare professionals to work, or even makes sampling possible, or even the use of next generation sequencing, which we use routinely for our cancer patients and their diagnostics, for actually testing thousands and thousands, 10,000 samples perhaps a day if needed, quickly and efficiently before things actually get out of hand. So I think while everyone is correct that this is a pandemic which we will not forget easily. I think we will all remember these are all the avenues that have already been put in place, which can then prevent actually prevent the crisis from happening in subsequent years. So repurposing, refurbishing, and recognizing these potentials that exist quickly. I think this is something we've all learned from this particular experience, and maybe it won't take 6 months to realize it the next time around. So yeah, that's what I would have to say for this. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, so perhaps to bring us back to what we talked about at the beginning of the panel discussion is at the end of the day, although we come from different perspectives and we're from different background and looking at approaching solutions at different parts of the solutions in this whole spectrum, we all have the same really vision, the same objective of really how do we deliver better care that is patient-centric, and how do we shift the paradigm from care to health. And that's really universal. It's not really, you know, for a pandemic per se, but it's really universal. How do we just change the paradigm? We're not really looking at just, you know, health, just care, but also health. What I personally have taken from the summary from each of the panelists here is that really we learn to collaborate better, and we really should do more, should have more collaboration. And we learn that different disciplines, when integrated, can do things a lot quicker. We need to be able to do integration better. And most of all, I think that we all recognize that public-private partnership is important. I feel we can try harder. We can always try harder and improve how the private and the public sectors can do better together. I'm always amazed when we think about the regulatory authority. I mean, you won't imagine that regulatory authority would be the innovative organization. But I mean, look at what they've done. I mean, they have EUA, they have, you know, the emergency use authorization. They have, in Singapore, we have the provisional authorization. So I think we need all of us to be innovative, to be willing to make exception during exceptional times. And I hope that we can all try harder, so that, you know, perhaps not just for crisis, but we, you know, as a result of this, we are able to, you know, serve, you know, really the health and the care better. Thank you. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank all our panelists. You know, maybe I will take now the opportunity to, you know, make sure that I thank everyone individually. So I want to first of all thank Professor Damien O'Connor, CEO of EDDC, and Professor Dean Ho, Director of the N1 Institute of NUS, and Dr. Yukti, CTO of Lucence, Dr. Gurpreet Singh, founder of Raspberry, and last but not least, Amrish Nair, co-founder and CEO of Biorhythm. Thank you everyone for taking the time to join us on this panel discussion and giving your insights into how we can do this better.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.